You see it all over right-wing media, these terrifying headlines of people being assaulted on mass transit. Which begs the question, would you really be safer in a car? Well, not to worry. Today, I'll bring receipts, safety, health, and crime data to show why mass transit risks are so exaggerated. I'll say a word or two about how to stay safer. This gets personal. And finally, I'll show how mass transit greens households, cities, and entire global supply chains to bring down crime. Welcome to Edenicity, best practices for sustainably abundant cities. Let's start with safety. According to U.S. National Safety Council crash statistics, cars have been getting much more dangerous than buses and trains for several years. When I first looked into these statistics, buses were about 50 times safer per passenger mile than cars. But today that number has risen to 70 times safer. Meanwhile, rail is about 20 times safer. And you might be wondering why rail doesn't do quite as well as buses, and the answer is that in the United States at any rate, rail is seldom protected from car traffic. But when it is protected, it can be hundreds if not thousands of times safer. For example, Japan's Shinkansen high-speed rail has been operating for 61 years with 0 fatal crashes. When I run the numbers, I find that compared to driving, Shinkansen has probably saved about 50,000 lives in that time. Now here's where it gets personal. I've never known anyone who died on mass transit, but in my 60 years on this planet, I've lost neighbors, family, friends, and co-workers to car crashes. There were also several who were severely injured, including a relative of mine who has suffered through 45 plus years of crippling pain as a result of car crashes. And it gets really heavy too. Between 1970 and 2019, cars claimed 35 times more lives than wars did, and 3 times more lives than crime plus wars. And again, that's in episode number 90. Of course, I couldn't help but run the numbers on one more group of people, which are viewers of this channel. Back in 2025, 300,000 unique individuals watched Edenicity. And when you run the statistics based on the United States traffic safety, roughly 35 viewers of this channel were lost to car crashes. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The inactivity due to a car-dependent lifestyle has been shown to be much more lethal than crashes in the long run, as are the diseases caused by car pollution. And this is not just from the emissions from internal combustion engines. It's also the airborne grit from the tires rolling on pavements. When I add it all up, it's likely that this channel lost 159 viewers to cars just last year alone. So I couldn't help but run one more set of numbers. And that is, how many of them would still be with us if all of their cities had Edenicity upgrades? When I ran those numbers, I found that nearly all of them, and maybe all of them, would still be alive. And again, that's really sobering. I'm just sorry we haven't been able to make this happen faster. But despite the crash statistics, there's still a lot of people who refuse to ride mass transit, either because it's not available in their area, or, in surprisingly many cases, because they're afraid of crime on mass transit. So let's talk about that. And again, this gets personal. I've been riding public transit, mostly buses, since I was 8 years old, and riding them by myself almost daily between the ages of 11 and 18, and a few times a week through a good chunk of my adult life. And all that time, I witnessed a loud argument once. A friend had a boombox stolen with the threat of an unseen gun 47 years ago when I was 13. A kid tried to bully me, but I embarrassed him in front of his friends, and he decided I wasn't worth it. And at 11, I'm surprised this didn't happen more often, I was smacked with a newspaper for talking loudly on the bus. But of course, I might have gotten lucky, so let's look at some statistics. And here I need to issue a mild trigger warning. We're actually going to discuss the crimes by name. I won't show you upsetting images, but we are talking about heavy topics. So here we go. In his definitive study of car versus transit crime, from 2016, Todd Littman pointed out most crimes don't happen on mass transit property. Compiling crime data reported to transit agencies as well as FBI crime data, he found that in 2010, only 1 in 1,000 murders happened on transit. And in that same year, while rape was a much more common crime, it was much less common on public transit. He did find that robbery was more common, but again, only 1 in 180 robberies happened on mass transit, and only 1 in 260 assaults happened on mass transit. So if violent crime is in your future, it's very likely that it is not going to happen on mass transit, even if you take mass transit every day. Why is it then that we all have this visceral sense that mass transit is less safe? Well, in some rare instances, there are stations that are relatively isolated and poorly patrolled that have accumulated a bad reputation for good reason. And there are places in this country where there have been crime waves of one sort or another. But here's what I think is going on. Transit crime is much more visible than car crime. On transit property, there's just more people, so there's more witnesses, and there's a lot more cameras, both carried by passengers and also surveillance cameras. Confounding this is the fact that crimes reported on transit property include crimes in park and ride routes, which I would consider to be part of the car transportation system. There's also the really huge media budgets that the automotive industry has had for well over a century. And by huge media budgets, I mean more than advertising. They've had the ability to do product placements and provide backgrounders that can subtly shape narratives. I'm not saying that there's specifically a conspiracy. I'm just saying that they have the money and the means to shape public opinion in a way that supports cars and makes people distrustful of mass transit. As for whether they choose to do this, draw your own conclusions. The point is, there are many reasons why crime on mass transit could make national news. Well, what about car crimes? And here there's a really different situation, what I would call a really gigantic crime stage with far less visibility. First of all, cars as a transit system include not just the cars, of course, but also roads, garages, parking spaces, parking lots, gas stations, alleys, and rest areas. And when you consider that people take 20 times more trips in cars than in public transit, and that cars use 20 times more space to move people from point A to point B, you find that the crime stage in the car system is something like 400 times larger than for mass transit. So when you think of the criminal triangle method mode of opportunity, the car system provides a 400 times larger opportunity for crime than mass transit. Also, when car crime does happen, there's something like 95% fewer cameras and witnesses. All of which means that car crime is vastly underreported. Combine that with the fact that it's also very common and it seldom makes more than local news at best. And there's a confounding factor as well. There's often no clear agency categories for car crime. The U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, for example, has many categories for street crime, but doesn't distinguish between whether those crimes happen to pedestrians or to people in cars. They also don't distinguish between people's carports, their garages, and their houses. All of those spaces are considered to be in the home. It can be very tricky to tease out these statistics. Now, what about the headlines that say that mass transit crime has been growing in recent years? Transit critics certainly love to scream about it, but they're hiding something. The real question is the increase a transit problem or a crime problem? Here's what I mean. Vital City has done such an amazing job reporting on this. I have a link in the description. They show that, indeed, violent crime has been increasing in the New York City subway system in recent years. Between 2018 and 2023, it went up 30%. But when we look at crime off the subway, we see that it too increased by something like 30%. So at least in New York City, the increase in crime on the subway appears to be part of a larger problem of growing crime in the city. And that's just crime in general. There are also car-specific crimes, such as 35,000 carjackings a year in the U.S., 500 road rage shootings per year, which works out to about 1 every 18 hours in the U.S., and vehicular assaults where people ram property or other people with their cars, and that is just simply not well tracked at all at the national level. So the question is, how do the car-specific crimes compare to the general rise in crime in recent years? Well, according to this graph by the Pew Research Center, U.S. road rage incidents increased 122% versus the 30% that we saw for the New York City subway. So U.S. road rage violence grew 4 times faster than subway violence between 2018 and 2023. Now, any one of these numbers by themselves shouldn't be too convincing. It's hard to get at these data. As we saw, they can be murky, but the trends are all consistent with one another, and they're all very clear. The crime and the growth in crime makes driving at least as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than public transit. And again, this gets personal. Every car I've ever owned over the years has been vandalized. One of them was stolen. I've had multiple break-ins. I've witnessed dozens of road rage incidents. I've seen gunplay on one occasion. Yes, I saw somebody shoot a gun from their car on one occasion. Well, shoot a gun in their car on one occasion. And sadly, I lost an extended family member to carjacking. And because of the details of this crime, I'm fairly sure that her death was reported as a result of a crash and not a carjacking. Now, again, this one hits me pretty hard because the last time I saw her alive, she was talking about carjackings. There had been this whole wave of them where she lived. And this came up just as she was heading out the door at a family event. And she started talking about how if this happened to her, she would try to cooperate and look for a way out. I had read some police advice on this a number of years earlier that said, no, if there's a gun, just get away from them as quick as you can, because if they're trying to isolate you, it's just going to get worse. And although I did make the point, it didn't really land. Unfortunately, it turned out that the gun in this case was not even real, and she died in the car chase. So, yeah, this stuff hits hard. Crime can happen despite best intentions, despite statistics anywhere. But now let's look at the cost of property crime. Back in 2016, the cost of typical car crime was about $6,000, which typically involves smash and grab, which is very expensive in vehicles, or theft of the whole vehicle. Whereas in mass transit, you're looking at having bags, wallets, jewelry, and phones stolen, which in 2016 added up to something like $1,000 per incident. Though, of course, today, both cars and the devices we carry are worth a lot more. The point still remains that property crime costs a lot more in cars. So how much safer could cities be with Edenicity? Now, here I had to get really careful with my calculations. And at first I thought I couldn't do this calculation at all. And I'm not going to walk you through the details, but they are all in the description below. So check that out. But the bottom line is that among the 300,000 viewers of this channel, 270 of them probably encountered violent crime associated with their cars, whether in their garage or a parking lot or in their car itself. Among the 300,000 viewers, we probably suffered $9 million of property loss. Now, if our cities had all been Edenized, so they were upgraded to mass transit, among other things, at the very worst, we would have 71% less crime and 95% less money lost to property crime. But this is an upper limit because we're assuming the same crime rates overall that we have today in these very disturbed times. But the part that nobody talks about is how Edenizing cities, that is, upgrading them to make much more economic and ecological sense, will change everything from household economics to global supply chains in ways that all reduce crime. Let's get into it, starting with household economics. Mass transit costs a lot less than cars, and it's much safer. With greater safety and health and more money in their pocket, households are bound to be much more stable, and this is bound to reduce crime in its own right. There's also a direct mental health effect from car pollution. For example, lead exposure due to leaded gasoline peaked between 1960 and 1980, and this has been linked to reduced impulse control, especially among adolescents, and indeed there was a crime wave in the 1980s and 1990s. There's a really excellent article that looks at this from many different critical angles that I've linked in the description. Now, when we build cities for public transit, we build them denser. This both shrinks the crime stage and increases the number of eyes on the street, both of which have been shown to reduce crime. Now, you might think this is just theory that gets rehashed in urbanist circles, but in episode 90, I showed that denser, transit-oriented cities from Vienna to Hong Kong have up to 95% lower crime rates than car-dependent cities like Los Angeles. So this isn't proof, but both theory and correlation are heading in the same direction. The other thing that happens when we build transit-oriented development is that there's less sprawl. And when there's less sprawl, there's more room for things like urban gardens. Now, a few people have raised the issue that more urban gardens would tend to create sprawl, but I completely debunked that in episode 134, where I showed that actual urban eco-villages on the ground can have higher density than the areas around them and still produce a significant portion of their food supply on site. But what has that got to do with crime? Well, think about it. These are cleaner, quieter, safer, healthier environments. And as I showed in the Kailash episodes, they can be much more affordable too. When you have more convenient, calmer urban environments with more public amenities and more access to jobs, all of those things move in the direction of social stability and less crime. There's also supply chains. Mass transit, as I showed in prior episodes, uses 98% less material than cars. It also lasts 2 to 3 times longer, and it's much more recyclable, all of which means that when cities upgrade to this type of a transit system, they are greatly reducing resource competition among nations, which means fewer wars, less trauma and poverty, and far less crime. Now, what about climate? Now, when you compare transit-oriented mixed-use multifamily development to sprawling car-dependent developments, you find that the vehicles themselves emit 83% less carbon dioxide per passenger kilometer. And because everything's closer together, people are making up to 90% fewer motorized trips altogether. And when you combine those statistics, even without the home efficiency improvements of multifamily versus detached houses, you get 98% less carbon dioxide pollution. This dramatically slows climate change, which leads to better food security, fewer migrations, and with that, less crime. Although in this case, when you look at the crime statistics with migrations, migrants on average have a very good record. I'm more concerned with crime against migrants. Then finally, there's geopolitics. Mass transit uses 80 to 97% less energy than the car system. This speeds the transition to solar and wind power and decentralizes power and, to some extent, wealth. This means less oligarchy, less inequality, and, yes, you guessed it, less crime. So putting this all together for city planners and anyone interested in shaping city policy, mass transit is a lot safer than cars. It's healthier, there's fewer crashes, it's a smaller crime stage, there's more security and witnesses with lower cost of theft, and it even promotes home and global stability in 7 different ways. All right, here are some of those past episodes I mentioned earlier. And thanks as always to the wonderful patrons. I really appreciate your support. Take care, stay green. See you next time.